The iron gates stood like an accusation against the morning sky, blocking the dirt road that had connected the Esperanza Ranch to the outside world for 3 generations. Victoria Ramirez stared at the ornate barrier that had appeared overnight, her heart sinking as she realized what it meant. Her neighbors had finally found a way to cut her off completely from the town that had once welcomed her family with open arms. Behind the gates, she could see the neat rows of identical houses that had sprouted like mushrooms after rain on what used to be open prairie. The Paradise Valley Improvement Association, they called themselves. Paradise, as if driving out the families who had built this valley from nothing was some kind of heavenly pursuit, Mrs. Ramirez? The voice belonged to Timothy Walsh, an earnest young lawyer who'd driven out from Denver to examine her property documents. I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than we initially thought. Victoria turned from the gates, her dark eyes weary with the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting the same battle over and over again. At 35, she should have been planning for her future. Maybe thinking about children and growing old on the land her grandfather had carved from the wilderness. Instead, she was fighting just to keep the ranch that was all she had left of her family. How complicated? She asked, though she suspected she already knew. Timothy pulled a surveyor's map from his leather case, his young face grave with the weight of bad news, according to the original land grants. This road, the one they've blocked, actually runs through a corner of your property. It was established as a public right-of-way in 1847, but the legal description was imprecise, meaning that while they can't legally block your access to town, they also can't use this road without your permission. And since they've installed gates on what appears to be your land, Timothy paused, a small smile breaking through his professional demeanor. Well, Mrs. Ramirez, it seems they've created quite a problem for themselves. Victoria felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. What kind of problem? The kind where they have to pay you a toll every time? They want to leave their perfect little community, Timothy replied. Because without this road, their only access to town is a 20-mile detour through the mountains. Before Victoria could respond to this unexpected development, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Riding up the valley came a group of men led by Harold Pemberton, president of the Paradise Valley Improvement Association. His expensive suit looked out of place on horseback, but his face held the satisfied expression of a man who believed he'd finally won a long war. Mrs. Ramirez, Pemberton called out as he dismounted near the gates. I trust you've had time to consider our final offer for your property. Victoria straightened her shoulders, drawing on the strength that had carried her through 5 years of steadily increasing pressure from Pemberton and his associates. I've considered it, Mr. Pemberton, and my answer remains the same. The Esperanza Ranch is not for sale. Pemberton's smile was cold as winter wind. I'm afraid circumstances may force you to reconsider. You see, these gates represent a new policy of the Paradise Valley Improvement Association. We've decided that this road poses a security risk, to our residents. A security risk. Victoria's voice rose with indignation. This road has been here for 50 years. My family has used it to drive cattle to market, to get supplies from town, to allow all manner of unsavory characters access to our peaceful community, Pemberton interrupted. Drifters, cattle rustlers, Indians, the sort of people who have no business in a civilized neighborhood. Victoria felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest. The unsavory characters Pemberton referred to were the vaqueros who worked her ranch, the Ute families who had been her grandfather's friends and trading partners, the traveling merchants who brought news and supplies from distant towns. In other words, anyone who didn't fit Pemberton's narrow vision of who belonged in the valley. This is a public road, she said firmly. You have no right to block it. Pemberton's smile widened. Actually, we do. You see, we've had the property lines surveyed, and it turns out this road runs entirely through land owned by the Paradise Valley Improvement Association. We purchased the rights from the territorial government last month. Timothy stepped forward, his legal training overriding his youth. I'm afraid you've been misinformed, Mr. Pemberton. This road predates your community by decades, and it runs through property that belongs to Mrs. Ramirez. Pemberton's eyes narrowed as he took in Timothy's city clothes and professional bearing. And you are? Timothy Walsh, attorney at law, representing Mrs. Ramirez in all matters concerning her property rights. Property rights, Pemberton repeated with contempt. How interesting. I suppose your client has shown you the proper documentation proving her ownership of this land? Victoria felt her stomach drop. The property documents for the Esperanza Ranch were a tangled mess of Spanish land grants, territorial agreements, and handshake deals that had been perfectly legal when her grandfather established the ranch, but might not hold up under modern scrutiny. Timothy, however, seemed unfazed. Mrs. Ramirez has clear title to all property described in the original Esperanza land grant of 1847, which includes this road and extends well beyond your current fence line. Pemberton laughed harshly. Original land grant? My dear boy, those old Spanish documents are barely worth the paper they're printed on. The territorial government has been reviewing all such claims, and I'm confident that Mrs. Ramirez will find her holdings significantly reduced. When the process is complete, Victoria's blood ran cold. She'd heard rumors that some of the old Spanish land grants were being challenged in court, that families who had lived on the same land for generations were losing everything to newer arrivals, with better lawyers and more political connections. In the meantime, Pemberton continued, these gates will remain closed to all unauthorized traffic. Mrs. Ramirez is, of course, welcome to use the mountain road like everyone else. The mountain road was barely more than a deer track, winding 20 miles through dangerous terrain before connecting to the main route to town. In winter, it was impassable. For a working ranch, it might as well not exist at all. You're trying to starve me out, Victoria said quietly. I'm trying to bring civilization to this valley, Pemberton replied. And civilization requires a certain uniformity for residents, people who share common values and backgrounds. The meaning was clear enough. Victoria was Mexican-American, in a valley that Pemberton wanted to be exclusively white. Her ranch was a working operation in an area he envisioned as a playground for wealthy Eastern investors. Her very existence was an obstacle to his vision of progress, but as Victoria stared at the gates that blocked her family's road, she noticed something that made her heart skip. Carved into one of the stone gateposts was a symbol she recognized, a small cross surrounded by a circle, the mark her grandfather had used to identify his property. Timothy, she said quietly, look at that gatepost. The young lawyer followed her gaze, his eyes widening as he spotted the carving. That's your grandfather's mark, isn't it? Victoria nodded, hope beginning to bloom in her chest. He carved that symbol on every boundary marker when he established the ranch if it's on their gatepost. That dot. Then they've built their gates on your land, Timothy finished, a grin spreading across his face. Mr. Pemberton, I'm afraid you've made a serious error. Pemberton's confidence wavered slightly. What are you talking about? Timothy pulled out a compass and began measuring distances between the various boundary markers visible along the road. His grin grew wider with each calculation. Gentlemen, he announced, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that Mrs. Ramirez does indeed have clear title to this road and the land on either side of it. The bad news is that your gates are blocking a private right-of-way, and every resident of Paradise Valley who uses this road without Mrs. Ramirez's permission is technically trespassing. Pemberton's face turned an alarming shade of red. That's preposterous. This is a public road. Actually, it's not, Timothy replied cheerfully. It's a private road that happens to provide public access. And under territorial law, the owner of such a road has the right to charge a toll for its use. Victoria stared at the young lawyer, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. A toll? A toll, Timothy confirmed. Which means, Mr. Pemberton, that every time you or any of your residents wants to leave Paradise Valley, you'll need to pay Mrs. Ramirez for the privilege. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Pemberton looked around at his associates, clearly searching for some way out of the trap he'd inadvertently created. This is ridiculous, he sputtered finally. We'll fight this in court. Well, you'll lose, Timothy interrupted calmly. And in the meantime, Mrs. Ramirez has every legal right to charge a toll for use of her road. Shall we say, $5 per wagon? A 10-4? Larger groups? Victoria almost laughed at the expressions on the men's faces. $5 was more than most cowboys made in a month. For the wealthy residents of Paradise Valley, it would be an annoyance. For their servants and workers, it would be a disaster. "You can't do this," Pemberton said desperately. It's extortion." "It's business," Victoria replied, finding her voice at last. "The same kind of business you've been conducting with my ranch for the past 5 years? The same kind of civilization you claim to want to bring to this valley?" But even as she spoke, Victoria felt a familiar hollow ache in her chest. This legal victory felt empty somehow, like winning a battle in a war that had already cost her everything that mattered. The ranch was safe, at least for now, but it was still a prison. She was still alone, still fighting the same battles her grandfather had fought, still watching the world change around her in ways that left no room for people like her. That's when she heard the sound that made her heart stop, the distinctive whistle of the evening freight train, echoing across the valley from the direction of town. But there was something different about it this time, something that made her look toward the mountains with sudden hope. "Victoria?" She turned at the sound of her name spoken in a voice she hadn't heard in 7 years but had never forgotten. Standing at the edge of the crowd of Paradise Valley residents was a man in travel-stained clothes, his dark hair showing touches of silver, his eyes holding the same gentle strength she remembered from their youth. "Miguel?" The name escaped, her lips like a prayer. Miguel Santos stepped forward, his gaze taking in the gates, the hostile faces of Pemberton's group, the young lawyer with his surveyor's maps. But when his eyes found Victoria's face, everything else seemed to fade away. "I got your letter," he said quietly. "The one you sent to Santa Fe. It took a while to find me, but I came as soon as I could." Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes. She had written that letter 6 months ago in a moment of desperate loneliness, not even knowing if Miguel was still alive, let alone if he would care about her troubles. She had poured out her heart about the ranch, about Pemberton's pressure, about the crushing isolation of trying to hold on to her family's legacy alone. "Miguel, I didn't know if you would come. I didn't even know if the letter would reach you." "To reach me," Miguel said, stepping closer. "And I came because... He paused, glancing at the crowd of strangers surrounding them. "Some things are more important than pride." Pemberton cleared his throat loudly, clearly irritated by this interruption to his humiliation. "I'm sorry, but who exactly are you?" Miguel turned to face the older man, his expression polite but distant. "Miguel Santos. I'm a civil engineer with the Colorado and Southern Railroad." Harold Pemberton, president of the Paradise Valley Improvement Association. "What's your business here?" "My business," Miguel replied calmly, "is surveying potential routes for a new railroad spur that would connect this valley to the main line. The railroad is very interested in developing freight service to support the region's mining and agricultural industries." Victoria felt her heart leap. A railroad connection would mean prosperity for the entire valley. Jobs for hundreds of workers, a future that didn't depend on the whims of men like Pemberton. However, Miguel continued, "Our surveys indicate that the most economical route would require extensive use of this road." He gestured toward the blocked passage. "If access is restricted, we may need to look at alternative routes through other valleys." Pemberton's face went white. His entire investment in Paradise Valley depended on the assumption that the railroad would eventually reach the area. Without that connection, his expensive houses would become white elephants in the middle of nowhere. "Surely," Pemberton said desperately, "we can reach some kind of accommodation. The road could remain open for railroad use. ... That would be up to the property owner," Miguel replied, his eyes finding Victoria's once again. "The railroad prefers to work with landowners who have clear title and a long-term commitment to the region." Timothy stepped forward, his legal mind clearly working through the implications. "Mrs. Ramirez, as the owner of this road, you would be entitled to negotiate directly with the railroad for any commercial use of your property." Victoria felt the world shifting around her like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. The road that Pemberton had tried to use as a weapon against her had become her greatest asset. The isolation he had tried to impose had made her the key to the valley's entire future. "I'd be happy to discuss terms with the railroad," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotions churning in her chest. "But first, I think Mr. Pemberton and I need to settle the matter of these gates." Pemberton looked around desperately, realizing that his carefully planned victory had become a complete disaster. Perhaps we were hasty in our approach. Surely we can work out some kind of mutual arrangement." "I'm sure we can," Victoria agreed. "The same kind of arrangement you offered me for my ranch. Take it or leave it. No negotiation. Final offer." "What are your terms?" Pemberton asked weakly. Victoria looked at Miguel, at Timothy, at the gates that had seemed like the end of her world just an hour earlier. An idea was forming in her mind, bold and risky, but somehow perfect. "I'll grant free access to this road for all residents of Paradise Valley," she said slowly. "In exchange, the Paradise Valley Improvement Association will officially recognize the Esperanza Ranch as a permanent fixture of this community, with all rights and privileges pertaining thereto," and Pemberton asked, sensing there was more. "And you'll drop your opposition to my application for a post office at the ranch crossroads. This valley needs a proper town center, and the crossroads is the natural location for it. A post office meant a town. A town meant businesses, families, a future that extended beyond Pemberton's narrow vision of what the valley should become. It meant that Victoria's ranch would become the heart of a real community instead of an obstacle to someone else's plans." Pemberton looked sick. That would ... that would change everything." Yes, Victoria agreed. "It would." Miguel stepped closer, his voice low enough that only Victoria could hear. "That's brilliant. A post office would give you legal standing as the founder of the town. You could apply for incorporation, establish your own local government." "Our own local government," Victoria corrected quietly. "If you're planning to stay." Miguel's eyes widened slightly. "Victoria, that letter you sent, you said you needed help, but you didn't say. I mean, I didn't know if you wanted me here as a friend or—" "I wanted you here as Miguel," Victoria replied, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "The same Miguel who used to talk about building something lasting together. The same Miguel who kissed me goodbye under the cottonwood tree and promised to come back when he'd made something of himself." "I came back before," Miguel said quietly. 3 years ago. But you were married then, and I thought—" "You thought wrong," Victoria said, tears flowing freely now. "Robert was a good man, but he was never you. He was never the person I dreamed about during the long winter nights, never the one I imagined growing old with on this land." Around them, the crowd had fallen silent, sensing that they were witnessing something profound and private. Even Pemberton seemed to recognize that larger forces were at work here than his petty schemes. Miguel reached out and gently took Victoria's hands in his. "I've spent 7 years building railroads across 3 territories, telling myself I was preparing for the future. But the truth is, I was running away from the past, running away from the memory of you, and now I want to stop running," Miguel said simply. "I want to build something lasting with you, Victoria. A railroad, a town, a life, all of it. Together." Victoria felt her heart soar as she looked into the eyes of the man she had never stopped loving. Around them, the evening light was painting the valley in shades of gold and rose. And for the first time in years, the future looked bright with possibility. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, never taking her eyes off Miguel's face. "Do we have a deal?" Pemberton looked around at his associates, at the gates that had become a symbol of his failure, at the railroad engineer whose presence had changed everything. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. "We have a deal," he said quietly. 2 years later, Victoria stood in the doorway of the Santos General Store and Post Office, watching the evening train arrive at the newly built depot across the street. The town of Esperanza had grown beyond her wildest dreams. 300 residents, 2 schools, a proper church, and a main street that bustled with commerce from dawn to dusk. Miguel came up behind her, slipping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. Their wedding ring caught the light from the sunset, still bright and new after 6 months of marriage. "Any regrets?" he asked, their private question that had become a daily ritual. Victoria leaned back against his solid warmth, watching as passengers disembarked from the train families coming to start new lives. Businessmen drawn by the valley's prosperity, young couples looking for opportunity and hope. "Only one," she replied with a smile. "What's that?" "That it took Harold Pemberton's gate to bring you back to me," Victoria said, turning in his arms, to look up at his face. "Though I have to admit, I'm grateful to him for one thing." "What's that?" "He taught me that sometimes the best way to tear down a wall is to charge people for the privilege of going around it."